Secretary-General had a question.
Mr. Secretary-General, you mentioned yesterday briefly a multinational force perhaps to guard the UN, which then former Ambassador Holbrooke picked up in numerous interviews. Could you elaborate on that?
No, I think yesterday the discussions we had concerned internationalization of the further internationalization of the process in Iraq. I think most member states, as you've heard this morning, would want to see further internationalization through broadening of a UN role to permit them to join the operations on the ground. And that those discussions cover both the political and economic reconstruction as well as the security aspects of the operation. And there has been a question whether a UN Blue Helmets can take over from the coalition, and I have made it quite clear that the UN Blue Helmets will not do that. We don't have the capacity, and we would not. But it is not excluded that the Council may decide to transform the operation into a UN-mandated multinational force operating on the ground with other governments coming in. But of course, as a
all right, we are listening to UN Secretary General Kofi Annan speaking with Foreign Secretary from Britain, Jack Straw, about the Iraq situation. They met this morning and are briefing reporters. Yesterday, there were meetings in the Security Council about the Iraq situation.
Threatened international peace and security are matters of interest and common interest to the whole of the international community.
On your second question, as Secretary General, I do have influence, but I don't write the mandates. The Council members are discussing it, and as I have indicated, there is serious discussions going on, and I have also suggested that these discussions take place behind closed doors for us to find a way forward, and then come into the public to discuss it. But obviously, there are discussions as to a deeper role for the UN. It is not the Secretary General who dictates, who goes to them and say, you either do this or I don't play, as you put your question. The Secretary General has to work with the Council and the member states. The UN is the member states, not the Secretary General. And we work hand in glove, and we work together, and we are going to be working together on this.
Mr. Secretary General, nevertheless, despite what you've just said, sir, I mean, now that you've heard from the British and the Americans, what is the kind of authority that you believe will work in Iraq now? And what are the concessions that you will need to establish some kind of unity on this in the Security Council?
No, I have given some suggestions to Foreign Secretary Straw and also to Secretary Colin Powell yesterday, and I'll be talking to other council members. And since I myself have suggested that the discussions take place behind closed doors, I would not want to make the mistake of being the first to discuss it here on camera. But what I will say is that in the last report I gave to the Security Council, in which I described what we have done and what we are doing, I also indicated what we can do and what further tasks the UN can take on. And I suggest that that report provides a very strong basis for a second resolution when the Council comes to that.
Do you have some kind of unity in the Security Council ultimately on this?
I think there can be unity in the Council, and this is one of the reasons why but it's going to take discussions, it's going to take negotiations, it's going to take give and take, and these things are best done behind closed doors, and that's my advice to the Council members.
Secretary General, are you working out a plan with the coalition to protect your staff that are still there in Baghdad?
Security obviously is of great concern to us, and it's also been part of our discussions this morning with Foreign Secretary and also with Secretary of State Colin Powell yesterday. I have a team that is on its way to Baghdad now to assess the security situation. There is no doubt that we will have to strengthen our security. We may have to adjust our ways of operating on the ground. And we would also need to take a look at UN operations elsewhere in the world. And of course, we will need to work with the coalition that has the capacity and has the responsibility for law and order in Iraq to give us help.
So they've offered their help, sir?
they will help, yes.
Thank you very much indeed. Thank you.
All right, the end of a news conference in New York City at the UN headquarters, where UN Secretary General Kofi Annan was meeting with Britain's Foreign Secretary Jack Straw. Their meetings are going on there today, as they did yesterday, with members of the Security Council, discussing really the prospect of stepping up an international role in the situation on the ground in Iraq, something the U.S. wants, but so far countries have said they're not interested in sending more troops there unless the UN takes on an enhanced leadership role there. That's the news on Iraq from New York City. In other news this morning, a big story developing in British Columbia, where fires have forced thousands of people out of their homes. Fire officials are hoping that gusting winds will die down this morning. Last night, the wind kicked up huge flames near Kelowna, BC, and not long after that, the evacuation orders went out. Here's a look at the situation throughout British Columbia this morning. Near Kamloops, the McClure Barrier Fire is now covering about 250 square kilometers. The fire near Chase has forced close to 1,000 people from their homes. It's only 20% contained. But by far, as we mentioned, the most threatening fire is in the Kelowna area. Just moments ago, we spoke to CBC radio reporter Chris Brown in Kelowna, and we asked him to update us on the situation.
The sun is up now in Kelowna, so there is less fire visible in the hills to the south of the city, but there is still a great deal of smoke, and that's making it difficult to see the extent of the damage from last night. At around 9 o'clock, fire crews were taken by surprise. They had constructed a 50-meter wide fire break and covered the area with fire retardant. Yet even with very light winds, the flames managed to jump across and were literally burning in people's backyards. Authorities immediately started to move residents out. They issued evacuation orders overnight for 10,000 people. In effect, what happened was there were about two-thirds more people evacuated than what they had ever planned for. For now, the damage tally is being done up. We know for sure that there have been 25 homes burned to the ground, perhaps others damaged. We were also told that as of just a few hours ago, there were still more fires burning. We do not know yet the extent of the property damage to this, but by the end of the day, it is expected to be substantial. We are also expecting high winds as well to pick up around noon hour, and that is going to create yet more havoc for the firefighters.
The CBC's Chris Brown in Kelowna, British Columbia. Fire crews in BC will be getting a helping hand soon from Canadian Army reservists in Alberta. More than 50 soldiers from Edmonton, Red Deer and Calgary are going to help fight the Okanagan Mountain fire. They'll train for a few days and then join the crews, scheduled to stay in British Columbia until the first week in September. In the Middle East today, revenge and retaliation are the words that seem to be on everyone's lips. Both Israelis and Palestinians are threatening more violence after a week that has already seen a deadly suicide bombing and a quick, lethal response from Israel. The CBC's Sina Katz reports from Jerusalem.
Thousands of angry mourners gathered in the streets of Gaza City today to catch a glimpse of the body of Ismail Abu Shanab, a Hamas leader killed yesterday when a missile fired from an Israeli Air Force helicopter blew up his car. Hamas has vowed revenge for the attack, and it has issued a joint statement with Islamic Jihad saying the self-declared ceasefire is over and retaliatory attacks against Israel have already been ordered. For its part, Israel says it will continue with what it calls targeted killings. One Israeli newspaper featured some of the possible targets today, borrowing the U.S. idea of Iraqi playing cards. Abu Shanab's card has been crossed out, but there are many more. President Yasser Arafat is the joker of the deck. Today, familiar scenes across the West Bank and Gaza. The Israeli military has set up checkpoints and roadblocks. Meanwhile, an Egyptian envoy arrived in Ramallah today for talks with President Yasser Arafat. Osama El-Baz is a senior political advisor to Egyptian President Hosni Mubarak. He's here to try to salvage the ceasefire that's been called off by the militants. The Palestinian Authority says it needs help.
Without the presence of American monitors and observers on the ground in order to guarantee the implementation of the roadmap and in order to prevent all violations by any side, and in order to push the process forward. Without this presence, we believe that things are liable to more deterioration.
The U.S. says the escalation of violence must end, and Secretary of State Colin Powell has asked President Arafat to do his part to calm the situation.
I call on Chairman Arafat to work with Prime Minister Abbas and to make available to Prime Minister Abbas those security elements that are under his control.
But that may be too late. The anger on these streets means more support for Hamas and less for a faltering Palestinian Authority. Sina Katz, CBC News, Jerusalem.
There is a report that the bombing at United Nations headquarters in Baghdad may have been partially an inside job. Investigators say the attackers might have gotten help from Iraqi security guards who worked there. There are stories that before the war, some guards at the compound had been agents of the Iraqi Secret Service. So far, the number of dead in Tuesday's truck bombing stands at 23, including 2 Canadians. Meantime, a group has claimed responsibility this morning for this week's deadly bombing at the UN headquarters. It calls itself the Armed Vanguards of the Second Mohammed Army and says it will carry out similar operations until every foreigner is out of Iraq. At least 23 people died in the truck bomb attack, including 2 Canadians. British Prime Minister Tony Blair expected to testify next week at the David Kelly inquiry. Kelly is the British government weapons advisor who committed suicide after finding himself in the middle of the Iraq controversy. He was the source for BBC reports accusing the government of distorting intelligence data to make its case for war. Meantime, a similar inquiry is getting underway in Australia. Today, the government faced strong criticism from a former intelligence analyst. He accused the government of fabricating stories and using misleading language to make its case.
The government was prepared to deliberately exaggerate the Iraqi WMD and terrorism threat so as to stay in step with the United States. I do not apologise for or withdraw from in any way my accusation that the Howard government misled the Australian public over Iraq, both through its own public statements as well as through its endorsement of allied statements.
Australian Prime Minister John Howard says his government did not ask officials to distort the intelligence data. He says his government made judgments based on the material that existed at the time. Now, in Ontario, the Premier, Ernie Eves, is now briefing reporters on the situation of the power outage last week and what we can look forward to today. Let's listen in.
Just under 21,000, about 20,800. And capacity is pretty close to 22,000 megawatts today, 21,846 at latest. We do have Pickering 8 up and running today, and it is contributing a little earlier than expected onto the grid. And Nanticoke 7 should be up 2 or 3 this afternoon. Tomorrow we hope to have several more units up, Bruce 6, Pickering 8, and Lakeview 2. And the hours that they come on stream range from about 6 p.m. to about 11 p.m., bearing in mind that with nuclear